32. Mother Bear carried medical supplies through war zone to save babies. What she did was heroic. The snow fell in whispers that night, each flake carrying secrets the world wasn't ready to hear. Jessica Brooks pressed her palm against the frosted window of the makeshift hospital, feeling the cold seep through the glass like death itself trying to find its way inside. She'd been standing there for nearly an hour, watching the tree line where the forest met the clearing, though she couldn't say exactly what she was looking for. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just something, anything, that might change what was coming. The babies were dying. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, quietly, the way snow covers a landscape, until everything familiar disappears. 3 newborns lay in the converted storage room they called a nursery, their tiny bodies fighting battles they didn't understand. Jessica had done everything she could with what little remained of their supplies. The antibiotics had run out 2 days ago. The IV fluids were down to their last bags. Even the basic vitamins that might give these infants a fighting chance were nothing more than empty bottles lined up on the shelf like tombstones. She turned away from the window and walked back through the narrow hallway. The building had been a school once, before the conflict came to this region. Now its classrooms held beds instead of desks, and the walls that once displayed children's artwork were bare, except for medical charts and emergency protocols written in hasty handwriting. The generator hummed in the basement, a constant reminder that they were running on borrowed time. Fuel was as scarce as medicine, and when it ran out, the heaters would stop. And in this cold, that meant death would come even faster. In the nursery, she checked on each baby. The first one, a girl they'd started calling Hope because her mother had whispered that word before she died, was breathing steadily, but her color was wrong. Too pale, too blue around the lips. The second, a boy whose parents nobody knew, hadn't opened his eyes in 12 hours. The third, another girl, was the strongest, but even she was starting to show signs of distress. Jessica adjusted their blankets, knowing it was a useless gesture but needing to do something with her hands. The door opened behind her, and she didn't need to turn to know it was Ethan Marshall. His boots had a particular sound against the worn linoleum, heavy but careful, like he was always ready to run or fight but trying not to disturb anyone. He'd arrived at the hospital 3 weeks ago with a convoy that was supposed to bring supplies. Instead, they'd brought wounded soldiers and empty promises that help was coming soon. Ethan had stayed when the convoy left, said he was assigned to security, but Jessica suspected he simply had nowhere else to go. "Any change?" he asked, his voice low. He always spoke quietly in the nursery, as if regular volume might shatter something precious. "They're holding on," Jessica replied, which wasn't really an answer but was all she could offer. She finally turned to look at him. His face was weathered beyond his years, probably no older than 30, but carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much. His uniform was clean but patched in places, and his rifle was always within reach, leaning against the doorframe now like a third person in their conversation. "I did another perimeter check," he said. "Nothing moving out there, too cold even for the wolves." Wolves. They'd been a problem in the early days, drawn by the smell of blood and death that seemed to hang over everything. But they'd disappeared recently, and nobody knew why. Just another mystery in a place that had too many of them. "You should get some rest," Jessica told him. "Nothing's going to happen tonight." "That's what everyone says before something happens," Ethan replied, but there was no real argument in it. They both knew they were just going through the motions, playing their roles in a story whose ending was already written. That's when they heard it. A sound from outside that didn't belong. Not the wind, not the settling of snow on the roof, but something else, something alive and heavy, moving through the darkness beyond the windows. Ethan's hand went immediately to his rifle, his entire body shifting from tired to alert in an instant. "Stay here," he said, but Jessica was already following him down the hallway. They moved together toward the main entrance, their footsteps synchronized without planning. Through the reinforced glass of the front doors, they could see the courtyard illuminated by the single functioning floodlight. Snow swirled in its beam like a static on an old television, and for a moment, that's all there was. Then the shadow appeared. It moved along the edge of the light, massive and dark against the white ground. At first, Jessica thought it might be a vehicle, someone arriving with the supplies they desperately needed. But the movement was wrong, too fluid, too organic. Ethan raised his rifle, peering through the scope. "What do you see?" Jessica whispered. "I'm not sure," he answered, and the uncertainty in his voice made her stomach tighten. Ethan was never uncertain. He always knew whether something was a threat or not, friend or foe, safe or dangerous. But now he stood frozen, watching through his scope as the shadow circled the edge of their sanctuary. The shadow stopped. For a long moment, nothing moved except the falling snow. Then, slowly, deliberately, it stepped into the light. It was a bear, but not just any bear. This creature was enormous, its dark fur thick with snow, its breath visible in great clouds that rose like smoke signals. It stood on all fours, but even so, its shoulder would have reached Jessica's chest. Its eyes caught the light and reflected it back. Two golden circles that seemed too intelligent, too aware. "Don't move," Ethan breathed, though Jessica couldn't have moved if she wanted to. Every instinct told her to run, to hide, to protect the babies, but her feet were rooted to the floor. Bears didn't come this close to human settlements, especially not in winter when they should be hibernating. And this one, there was something different about it. The way it stood, patient and still, like it was waiting for something. The bear took another step forward, and that's when Jessica saw what it was carrying. In its mouth, held as gently as a mother cat might carry a kitten, was a bag. A medical supply bag, the kind they used to have dozens of before everything fell apart. The bear walked slowly to the entrance, never breaking eye contact with them through the glass, and set the bag down carefully on the concrete step. "That's not possible," Ethan said, his voice barely audible. The bear backed away a few steps, then turned and walked back toward the forest. But just before it disappeared into the darkness, it looked back over its shoulder, a gesture so human-like that Jessica felt her breath catch. Then it was gone, swallowed by the night in the snow, leaving only the bag behind as proof it had been there at all. They stood frozen for another minute, maybe two, before Ethan finally moved. He kept his rifle raised, scanning the darkness as he slowly opened the door. The cold air rushed in like water breaking through a dam, but he ignored it, reaching down to grab the bag and pull it inside. Only when the door was locked again did they both remember to breathe. "Open it," Jessica said, her hand shaking though not from cold. Ethan set his rifle aside and unzipped the bag. Inside, packed carefully and protected from the elements, were medical supplies. Antibiotics, still sealed and within their expiration dates. 4 bags filled with precious fluids. Vitamins, bandages, even a small supply of morphine. Everything they needed to keep the babies alive for at least another week, maybe 2 if they were careful. "Where did this come from?" Jessica asked, though she knew Ethan had no more answers than she did. She picked up one of the antibiotic vials, checking the label. It was real, legitimate, not some counterfeit that would do more harm than good. "Bears don't do this," Ethan said, stating the obvious because sometimes the obvious needed to be said out loud to make sense of the impossible. They don't deliver medical supplies. They don't even come near places like this unless they're starving or rabid, and that one looked healthy. Jessica thought about the bear's eyes, the intelligence she'd seen there. Maybe someone trained it. Who? Everyone who lived around here is either gone or... He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what happened to the people who used to call this region home. They carried the supplies to the nursery, and Jessica immediately began preparing the antibiotics. As she worked, drawing the precious medicine into syringes, she found herself thinking about the bear. The way it had set the bag down so carefully, like it understood what it was carrying. The way it had looked back before disappearing, as if making sure they'd understood the gift. The first injection went to Hope, the little girl whose breathing had grown more labored through the night. Then the boy who hadn't opened his eyes. Then the strongest girl who might not have needed it yet, but would soon enough. Within an hour, Jessica had all 3 babies stabilized, their IVs running with fresh fluids, their tiny bodies beginning to fight back with the help of modern medicine. "It doesn't make sense," Ethan said. He was standing by the window now, looking out at the forest where the bear had vanished. "None of this makes sense." "Does it need to?" Jessica asked. She was exhausted, but felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks. Not quite hope, but something close to it. The babies have what they need. That's what matters. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't that simple. Nothing in their world was ever that simple. The bear would haunt her thoughts, she knew. The mystery of it, the impossibility of it, the strange feeling that they'd witnessed something beyond ordinary understanding. The next 3 nights passed without incident. The babies improved slowly but steadily. Hope opened her eyes on the 2nd day, and the boy started taking formula on the 3rd. Jessica barely left the nursery, sleeping in a chair between their makeshift cribs, waking every few hours to check their vitals and adjust their medications. Ethan maintained his patrols, but she noticed he spent more time watching the forest than before. On the 4th night, the bear returned. Jessica was actually awake when it happened, sitting by the window with a cup of cold coffee that she'd been nursing for hours. She saw the shadow first, moving between the trees with that same fluid grace. Her heart started racing, but this time it wasn't entirely fear. There was anticipation, too, curiosity about what would happen next. The bear emerged from the forest carrying another bag. This time, it came closer to the building, close enough that Jessica could see the details of its face in the floodlight. There were scars there, old ones that had healed long ago, and its muzzle was touched with gray that suggested age. But its movements were strong and purposeful as it set the 2nd bag next to the entrance. This time, Jessica didn't wait for Ethan. She went to the door herself, though she did take his rifle from where he'd left it leaning against the wall. The bear was already backing away when she opened the door, but it stopped when it saw her. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they looked at each other across the snowy courtyard. Woman and beast, separated by species and circumstance but connected by something Jessica couldn't name. "Thank you," she said out loud, feeling foolish but needing to say it anyway. The bear tilted its head slightly, a gesture so surprisingly expressive that Jessica almost smiled. Then it turned and walked back toward the forest, taking the same path it had come. Just before it disappeared into the trees, it looked back again, and Jessica raised her hand in what felt like a wave goodbye. The 2nd bag contained more antibiotics, but also something else. Baby formula, the good kind that was fortified with everything growing infants needed. There were also blankets, soft and clean and warm, nothing like the rough military-issue ones they'd been using. At the bottom of the bag, wrapped in plastic to protect it from moisture, was a piece of paper. Jessica's hands trembled as she unfolded it. The writing was shaky, like someone very old or very cold had struggled to form the letters. The babies must live. They are the future. I cannot come myself, but she knows the way. Trust her. There was no signature, no indication of who had written it. Jessica read it 3 times, then showed it to Ethan when he came running, having heard the door open. "Someone's out there," he said after reading the note. "Someone's sending the bear." But who? And how did they know about the babies? Ethan studied the paper, turning it over as if answers might be written on the back. The handwriting looks old. Educated, but old. See how the letters are formed? That's not how they teach writing anymore. He was right. The cursive was elegant despite its shakiness, the kind Jessica remembered from her grandmother's generation. But that only deepened the mystery. Everyone from that generation who'd lived in this area was gone, evacuated or worse when the conflict began. "We should try to follow the bear," Ethan suggested. "Find out where it's coming from." "It's too dangerous," Jessica argued, though part of her wanted to know as badly as he did. "We can't leave the babies." "Then I'll go alone." "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "We stay together. All of us. Whatever this is, whoever is doing this, they're helping us. Let's not ruin it by pushing too hard." Ethan didn't look convinced, but he nodded. They both knew she was right. In their world, gifts were rare, and mysteries were often better left unsolved. Pushing too hard, asking too many questions, that's how people disappeared. The bear came every 3 or 4 nights after that. Always at the same time, always following the same routine. It would emerge from the forest, leave a bag of supplies, wait to be acknowledged, and then disappear again. Each delivery contained exactly what they needed most, as if someone was watching, keeping track of their situation. By the 3rd week, all 3 babies were thriving. Hope had gained weight, and her color was healthy pink. The boy, whom they'd started calling Samuel after finding a small tag with that name sewn into one of the donated blankets, was alert and responsive. The 3rd girl, now called Lily, was actually the strongest of all, gripping Jessica's finger with surprising strength when she held her. But as the babies grew stronger, Jessica grew more curious about their mysterious benefactor. The notes continued to come, always brief, always in that same shaky handwriting. She remembers the way. Let her guide you when the time comes. The little ones grow strong. This is good. Spring will come, be ready. That last note arrived on a particularly cold night when the temperature dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of the windows. The bear had struggled through snow that came up to its belly, and Jessica could see exhaustion in its movements. When it set down the bag, it didn't immediately leave. Instead, it lay down in the snow, just for a moment, its great sides heaving with effort. Jessica made a decision that Ethan would later call either very brave or very stupid. She took some of their precious food supplies, dried meat and bread they'd been rationing, put them in a bag, and walked outside. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her eyes water. But she kept walking, slowly, carefully, toward the bear. It raised its head to watch her but didn't move otherwise. When she was about 10 feet away, close enough to see the ice crystals forming on its fur, she set the bag down and backed away. "You need to eat too," she said, her voice carried away by the wind almost before the words left her mouth. The bear looked at her for a long moment, then slowly got to its feet. It walked to the bag, sniffed it, then picked it up gently in its mouth. But instead of eating it there, it carried it back toward the forest. Just before disappearing into the trees, It did something that made Jessica's breath catch. It nodded. A clear, deliberate movement that couldn't be mistaken for anything else. When she told Ethan about it later, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We're going to follow it. Not to push, not to ruin anything, but because whoever is out there, they might need help too. The bear is exhausted. You saw it. Whatever journey it's making, it's taking a toll." Jessica wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. The bear was old. That much was clear from the gray in its muzzle and the way it moved when it was tired. And the notes suggested someone who was also elderly, someone who couldn't make the journey themselves. What if they were sick? What if they needed help as much as the babies had? They prepared carefully. Jessica arranged for one of the other nurses, a woman named Avery Johnson, who'd arrived with a group of refugees, to watch the babies. She was competent and caring, and the babies were stable enough now that Jessica felt she could leave them for a few hours. Ethan gathered supplies, medical equipment in case they found someone injured, food and water, emergency blankets, and, of course, his rifle, though Jessica made him promise not to use it unless absolutely necessary. They waited by the window on the night the bear usually came. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world crystal clear and bitter cold under a moon that was almost full. The forest looked like something from a fairy tale, all silver shadows and sparkling frost, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. The bear appeared right on schedule, carrying another bag. But this time, when it set the bag down, it didn't immediately turn to leave. Instead, it stood there, looking at the building, waiting. Jessica and Ethan exchanged glances, then quietly made their way outside. The bear watched them approach, its golden eyes calm and knowing. When they were close enough, it turned and began walking toward the forest, but slowly, looking back every few steps to make sure they were following. "It wants us to come," Ethan said unnecessarily. They followed the bear into the trees, where the moonlight filtered through bare branches, creating a lattice of light and shadow on the snow. Their breath came out in clouds that hung in the still air, and their footsteps crunched loudly in the silence. The bear led them along what must have once been a path, though it was now covered by snow. Every so often, it would stop and look back, waiting patiently for them to catch up. The journey felt longer than it probably was. Time moves differently in forests at night, especially when you're following a bear through a war zone toward an unknown destination. Jessica found herself thinking about all the stories she'd heard as a child, about magical animals that led heroes on quests. But this wasn't a fairy tale. The cold was real, the danger was real, and somewhere at the end of this path was a real person who'd been sending help when they needed it most. After what might have been an hour, or might have been 3, the trees began to thin. Ahead, Jessica could see a structure, a small cabin that looked like it had been there for decades. Smoke rose from its chimney, a thin line of gray against the night sky. The windows glowed with warm light that seemed impossibly welcoming after their cold journey. The bear led them to the front door, then lay down beside it like a guardian. Up close, Jessica could see how tired it was, how much effort each journey to the hospital must have cost. She reached out slowly, carefully, and when the bear didn't react, she placed her hand on its massive head. The fur was thick and warm, and she could feel the steady breathing beneath. "Good girl," she whispered, somehow knowing the bear was female. "Good, brave girl." The door opened before they could knock. The man standing there was ancient, his face a map of wrinkles and his body bent with age, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He was wearing multiple layers of clothing and leaning heavily on a carved walking stick, but he smiled when he saw them, a smile that transformed his entire face. "You came," he said, his voice exactly as Jessica had imagined from the handwriting, educated but aged, like paper that had yellowed with time. "I hoped you would, but I wasn't sure. Please come in. We have much to discuss." The inside of the cabin was warm and cluttered in the way of places that have been lived in for many years. Books were stacked on every surface, medical journals mixed with veterinary texts and what looked like children's stories. The walls were covered with photographs, many of them featuring a younger version of the man with various animals, but predominantly with bears. "My name is Dr. Marcus Webb," the old man said, settling carefully into a chair by the fire. "Though I haven't used the doctor part in many years. Veterinarian, actually, retired long before all this started." He gestured vaguely at the world outside, encompassing the war and everything that came with it. "You sent the supplies," Jessica said. It wasn't a question. "I had them stored here, Doctor," Webb replied. "My wife, she was a pediatric nurse. Like you, Dr. Brooks. Oh yes, I know who you are. Word travels even in isolation. She passed 5 years ago, but I kept all her supplies. Never knew why, just couldn't bear to throw them away. Then, when I heard about the babies—" "How did you hear?" Ethan asked, his voice careful but not threatening. "There are still a few of us, old ones, hiding in these woods, Doctor," Webb said. "We have ways of communicating, sharing news. When I heard about the hospital, about the babies with no supplies, I knew what I had to do. But I can't make that journey anymore, my legs, you see. So I asked Masha to help." "Masha?" Jessica asked. "The bear, Doctor." Webb smiled. "I raised her from a cub. Her mother was killed by poachers, and I found her nearly dead from starvation. That was 15 years ago. She's old for a bear now, but she remembers. She remembers everything." He stood slowly and walked to a photograph on the mantel. It showed him, much younger, with a tiny bear cub in his arms. "I trained her to help me with my work. She would carry supplies to remote locations, places where vehicles couldn't go. She understood. Somehow she always understood what was important." "But how did you train her to go to the hospital specifically?" Ethan asked. Dr. Webb's eyes twinkled. "I didn't. I just told her where the babies were and that they needed help. She figured out the rest. Bears are much smarter than most people realize, and Masha, well, Masha is special." As if hearing her name, the bear pushed open the door with her nose and patted inside. Jessica and Ethan tensed, but Dr. Webb just laughed. "She has her own room," he said, pointing to a doorway that led to what might have once been a bedroom, but was now filled with straw and blankets. "She comes and goes as she pleases." Masha walked over to Doctor Webb and gently rested her massive head on his lap. He stroked her fur with hands that shook slightly but were still gentle. "She lost cubs once," he said quietly. 3 of them to a harsh winter. I think that's why she was so determined to help your babies. She remembers what it's like to lose the young ones." Jessica felt tears prick her eyes. She thought about all the nights she'd watched the bear arrive with supplies, never knowing the story behind it. An old man and his bear, working together to save lives in the middle of a war zone. It was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. "The supplies are running low, Doctor," Webb continued. "I've given you almost everything I have. But spring is coming, and with spring the roads will open. Help will come, real help. You just need to hold on a little longer. You could come with us," Jessica offered, "to the hospital. It's safer there and warmer." Dr. Webb shook his head. "This is my home. These woods, this cabin, Masha. This is where I belong. But knowing those babies are alive and growing strong, that's enough for me. That's my contribution to the future. They stayed for another hour, sharing tea and stories. Dr. Webb told them about his wife, about the years they'd spent in these woods helping both animals and people. He showed them photographs of children they'd helped deliver in the remote villages, of animals they'd saved, of a life dedicated to healing in all its forms. When it was time to leave, Doctor, Webb insisted on giving them one more bag of supplies. "The last of it," he said, "but you won't need more. I can feel it in my bones the way I can feel weather changing. Help is coming." Masha walked them back to the hospital, moving slowly but steadily through the forest. When they reached the edge of the clearing, she stopped and looked at Jessica one more time. This time, Jessica didn't hesitate. She wrapped her arms around the bear's neck, feeling the warmth and strength of the creature who'd saved the babies' lives. "Thank you," she whispered into the thick fur. "Thank you for everything." The bear made a sound, soft and low, that might have been acknowledgement or might have been goodbye. Then she turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows between the trees. 3 days later, just as Dr. Webb had predicted, the convoy arrived. Real medical supplies, fresh personnel, everything they needed. The babies were evacuated to a proper hospital where they could receive the care they deserved. Hope, Samuel, and Lily all survived and thrived, growing into healthy children who would never know how close they'd come to death. Jessica went back to look for Doctor Webb and Masha once the situation had stabilized, but the cabin was empty. The neighbors in the area said he'd passed peacefully in his sleep a week after their visit, and Masha had disappeared into the deep woods and never returned. Some said she died of grief, others that she was still out there, watching over the forest like a guardian spirit. But Jessica knew the truth. She'd seen it in the bear's eyes that last night, the same thing she'd seen in Dr. Webb's. They had completed their mission, delivered their message, saved the lives that needed saving. Sometimes that's all any of us can do, pass along kindness when it's needed most, create miracles out of simple acts of love and determination. Years later, when the war was just a memory and the babies had grown into young adults, Jessica would tell them the story of the bear who brought medical supplies through a war zone. They would laugh and say it sounded like a fairy tale, too magical to be real. But Jessica would show them the photograph she'd taken with her phone that night. A blurry image of a great bear carrying a medical bag through the snow, and they would grow quiet, understanding that sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the true ones. The morning after the convoy left with the babies, Jessica found herself standing in the empty nursery, unable to shake the feeling that something remained unfinished. The room felt hollow without the soft breathing of infants, without the constant worry that had lived in her chest for so many weeks. Ethan found her there, staring at the empty cribs that had been left behind, too worn and makeshift to be worth transporting. "They're safe now," he said. But she could tell from his voice that he felt it too, the strange incompleteness of their story. They had saved the babies, yes, but the mystery of Dr. Webb and Masha haunted them both. How had an old veterinarian survived alone in those woods? Where had all those medical supplies really come from? And most puzzling of all, why had Masha known exactly what to do, exactly where to go? "I want to go back," Jessica said, "to the cabin. There's something we're missing." Ethan didn't argue. The war had moved on from their region, leaving behind the peculiar quiet that follows violence, like the world holding its breath. They had time now, time to seek answers to questions that might not matter to anyone but them. They set out the next day, following the path they remembered through the forest. Without Masha to guide them, it took longer to find the way, and twice they had to backtrack when the trail seemed to disappear under fresh snow. But eventually they saw the cabin through the trees, its chimney cold and smokeless now, a monument to something finished. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was as they remembered except for the absence of life. The photographs still covered the walls, the books still towered in their precarious stacks, but without Doctor Webb's presence, it all felt like a museum exhibit rather than a home. Jessica walked slowly through the rooms while Ethan examined the medical supplies that remained, mostly empty containers now, evidence of the generosity that had saved 3 lives. In what had been Masha's room, Jessica found something that stopped her cold. The walls, which she hadn't noticed in detail during their previous visit, were covered with maps. Not military maps or standard topographical ones, but hand-drawn routes through the forest, marked with symbols she didn't understand. Each map showed a different path, and at the end of each path was a small drawing of a building. Some she recognized, as villages she'd heard of. Others were unfamiliar, but one made her heart skip. It was clearly their hospital, drawn with surprising accuracy, and the path leading to it was worn from being traced many times. "Ethan," she called, and he came quickly, alert to the tone in her voice. She showed him the maps, and together they studied them, beginning to understand what they were looking at. These weren't just random routes. They were delivery paths, dozens of them, maybe more. "He wasn't just helping us," Ethan said slowly. "Look at the dates written in the corners. Some of these go back years." They were right. In Dr. Webb's shaky handwriting, dates were marked on each map, some from before the war, others from during the worst of the fighting. Each path represented a journey, a delivery of supplies to someone who needed them, and on many of the maps there were small notations. Medicine delivered, food for family of 5, blankets for winter, antibiotics for the children. In a desk drawer, Jessica found a journal, its leather cover worn smooth from handling. She opened it carefully, and Dr. Webb's voice seemed to speak from the pages. "Day 1247 since Margaret passed. Masha completed another delivery today, this time to the refugee camp near the old mine. They needed antibiotics desperately. I worry about her making these journeys. She's not young anymore, and neither am I. But Margaret would have wanted us to continue. She always said that healing doesn't stop at the hospital door, that sometimes you have to bring the medicine to the people who can't come to you." Jessica read entry after entry, each one detailing another mission of mercy. Dr. Webb and Masha had been running their own medical supply network for years, using his wife's stored supplies and what he could gather from abandoned clinics and hospitals. The bear had been trained not just to deliver, but to assess, to understand who needed help most urgently. "Listen to this," Jessica said, reading aloud. "Masha returned today with blood on her paws. I was terrified she'd been hurt, but she led me back through the forest to a crashed vehicle, a family trapped inside. We saved them, all 4 of them. She knew. Somehow she always knows who needs help." Ethan was examining the photographs more closely now, and he called Jessica over to look at one in particular. It showed Dr. Webb and his wife, much younger, standing with a group of people in medical uniforms. Behind them was a building that looked familiar despite the passage of years. "That's our hospital," Ethan said, "before it was converted, when it was still a school." Jessica looked closer and saw he was right. And there, in the group of people, was a face she recognized from old staff photos at the hospital. "That's Dr. Morrison," she said. "He was the chief of staff 20 years ago. They knew each other. The pieces were beginning to form a picture. Dr. Webb and his wife hadn't been random hermits in the woods. They'd been part of the medical community here, connected to the hospital and the people who worked there. When the war came and they'd retreated to their cabin, they hadn't abandoned their calling. They'd simply found a different way to continue it. In another room, they found more evidence of the network doctor. Webb had built radio equipment, old but functional, hidden behind a false panel in the wall. Lists of contacts. Some crossed out with dates that Jessica recognized as when various villages had been evacuated or destroyed. And maps of supply caches, hidden throughout the forest, marked with symbols that matched those on Masha's delivery routes. He was a one-man humanitarian operation, Ethan said, with something like awe in his voice. Him and the bear. They spent hours in the cabin, uncovering more of the story with each drawer they opened, each journal they read. Dr. Webb had documented everything meticulously, as if he knew someone would eventually need to understand what he'd done. There were photographs of Masha at different ages, showing her training, her first successful delivery, her gentle interaction with children who'd been terrified until they saw how calm she was. One entry particularly moved Jessica. Today marks 5 years since we started this work. Masha has completed over 200 deliveries. We've helped approximately 500 people, though the exact number is hard to know. Some were one-time emergencies, others we've been supplying regularly for months. The military on both sides seems to ignore us, perhaps thinking I'm just a crazy old man with a pet bear. If only they knew that this pet has saved more lives than most medals of honor could claim. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the cabin windows, Jessica found one final journal, hidden beneath Dr. Webb's bed. This one was different, more personal, less about the work and more about his thoughts. The last entry was dated just days before they'd met him. I feel the end approaching, not with fear, but with a strange peace. Masha brought the young doctor and the soldier to me, just as I'd hoped she would. They needed to know, to understand that kindness persists even in the darkest times. The babies they're saving will grow up in a world that needs to remember that. When I'm gone, I hope Masha will return to the wild where she belongs. She's given enough of her life to human concerns. But I also hope that someone will remember what we did here, not for glory or recognition, but as proof that one person and one bear can make a difference. Jessica was crying by the time she finished reading, and she wasn't ashamed of the tears. Ethan stood beside her, his usual stoic expression softened by what they'd discovered. They carefully packed the journals and some of the photographs, knowing they needed to be preserved, that this story needed to be told. As they prepared to leave, something made Jessica look out the back window. There, at the edge of the forest, stood Masha. The bear was watching the cabin, still and silent as a guardian statue. Jessica grabbed the last of the dried meat from Dr. Webb's kitchen and walked outside, moving slowly, respectfully. Masha didn't run. She waited as Jessica approached and set the food down between them. For a moment they simply looked at each other. Two females who'd fought to save lives in their own ways. Then Masha did something extraordinary. She walked forward, past the food, and pressed her great head against Jessica's chest, just for a moment, a gesture of farewell and perhaps of gratitude. "He's at peace now," Jessica whispered to the bear. "You did everything he asked and more. You can rest now, too." Masha pulled back and looked at Jessica with those golden eyes that held too much understanding. Then she picked up the food and walked into the forest. This time, Jessica knew she wouldn't return. The bear's work was done. They walked back to the hospital in the gathering darkness, carrying the weight of the story they'd uncovered. Over the following weeks, Jessica compiled Dr. Webb's journals into a record of what he and Masha had accomplished. She sent copies to medical organizations and humanitarian groups, making sure their work wouldn't be forgotten. The response was overwhelming. People who'd received mysterious deliveries of supplies during the war came forward with their own stories. A mother whose child had survived pneumonia thanks to antibiotics that appeared on her doorstep. An elderly man who'd received insulin just when his supply ran out. A family that had found blankets and food outside their shelter during the coldest part of winter. All of them described the same thing: a large bear, always careful, always gentle, leaving exactly what was needed most. The military eventually confirmed what Jessica and Ethan had suspected. They'd known about Dr. Webb and Masha, but had chosen to leave them alone, recognizing them as non-combatants providing humanitarian aid. One officer admitted that he'd actually helped protect their supply routes, making sure patrols avoided the areas where Masha traveled. "We called her the Medicine Bear," he said. Some of the younger soldiers thought she was a myth, a story people made up to explain unexpected supplies. But I saw her once carrying a bag through the snow. It was the most surreal thing I've ever witnessed in war, and I've seen plenty of strange things. Months turned into years, and the story of Dr. Webb and Masha became legend in the region. The cabin was preserved as a historical site, a monument to the quiet heroism that can exist even in the midst of conflict. Medical schools began teaching their story as an example of innovative humanitarian aid and the unexpected partnerships that can save lives. Jessica returned to work at a proper hospital once the region stabilized, but she never forgot those weeks when a bear brought medical supplies through a war zone. She kept a photograph on her desk, the one clear image she'd managed to capture of Masha carrying the medical bag. When people asked about it, she would tell them the story, watching their expressions shift from skepticism to wonder as they realized she was telling the truth. Ethan stayed in touch, eventually leaving the military to work in humanitarian aid. He said that meeting Dr. Webb and Masha had changed his perspective on what was possible, on how help could come from the most unexpected sources. He worked in conflict zones around the world, always looking for the local heroes, the quiet saviors who worked without recognition or reward. The 3 babies grew up strong and healthy. Hope became a doctor, inspired by the story of how she'd been saved. Samuel went into environmental conservation, dedicated to protecting the wilderness that had harbored their unlikely savior. Lily became a teacher, sharing the story with new generations, making sure it wouldn't be forgotten. On the 5th anniversary of Dr. Webb's death, a memorial was erected at the site of the cabin. The bronze sculpture showed an old man and a bear, standing side by side, looking out over the forest. The plaque read simply, "Dr. Marcus Webb and Masha. They brought medicine through the darkness and proved that compassion knows no boundaries." Jessica spoke at the dedication ceremony, telling the full story to a crowd that included military officials, humanitarian workers, and locals who remembered the war. But the most moving moment came when an old woman approached the memorial after the ceremony. She placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at its base and whispered something Jessica couldn't hear. When asked, the woman explained that her grandson had been one of the babies in a village doctor. Webb and Masha had supplied with antibiotics years before the war. "I never knew who brought the medicine," she said. "It just appeared one night when my daughter was desperate. The baby was so sick, and we had nothing. Then in the morning, there it was. Exactly what we needed. We called it a miracle. Now, I know it was something better than a miracle. It was kindness." As the years passed, sightings of Masha became rare, then stopped altogether. Some said she died peacefully in the deep woods, finally at rest after years of service. Others claimed to still see her occasionally, a shadow moving between the trees, watching over the forest and its inhabitants. Jessica chose to believe that Masha had found peace, whether in death or in a return to the wildlife she'd been born to live. The impact of their story rippled outward in ways Dr. Webb could never have imagined. Humanitarian organizations began experimenting with using trained animals in supply delivery to remote areas. Veterinary schools added courses on the human-animal bond in crisis situations. Military protocols were updated to better recognize and protect non-traditional humanitarian efforts. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on the people who'd lived through those dark days of war. The story of the medicine bear became a source of hope, proof that even in the worst of times, help could come from unexpected places. Parents told it to their children as a bedtime story, adding their own embellishments but always keeping the core truth: that an old man and a bear had worked together to save lives when everything else had failed. Jessica often thought about that first night when she'd seen Masha through the hospital window, a shadow at the edge of the light carrying an impossible gift. She thought about Dr. Webb, choosing to use his final years not in comfortable retirement but in service to others. She thought about Masha, whose animal intelligence had somehow understood the importance of her mission, who had pushed through exhaustion and danger to deliver hope in the form of medical supplies. The war eventually became history, the kind studied in schools and analyzed by scholars. But for those who lived through it, the real history was in stories like Dr. Webb and Masha's. Not the grand strategies or political machinations, but the individual acts of courage and compassion that had kept humanity alive in the darkest hours. One day, nearly a decade after the events, Jessica received a package with no return address. Inside was a leather collar, worn and weathered, with a brass tag that read Masha on one side and beloved friend on the other. There was also a note in handwriting she didn't recognize. Found this in a cave deep in the forest, along with signs that a bear had lived there for many years. Thought you should have it. She's at peace now, but her legacy lives on in every life she saved. Jessica held the collar, feeling its weight, imagining it around Masha's powerful neck as she carried out her missions of mercy. She had it framed along with one of Dr. Webb's journal pages and the photograph of Masha, creating a small memorial in her office. Young medical students would sometimes ask about it, drawn by the unusual combination of items. Jessica would tell them the story, watching their faces change as they understood that medicine wasn't just about hospitals and procedures, but about finding ways to help, no matter how unconventional. She would tell them about an old veterinarian who used his knowledge to save human lives, about a bear who became an unlikely hero, about how compassion can take forms we never expect. The last time Jessica visited the cabin site, it was spring. The memorial stood weathered but solid, surrounded by wildflowers that had been planted by locals who remembered. She stood there for a long time, thinking about all that had happened, all the lives that had been touched by Dr. Webb and Masha's extraordinary partnership. As she turned to leave, movement at the forest edge caught her eye. For just a moment she thought she saw a familiar shape, a large shadow moving between the trees with that distinctive rolling gait she remembered so well. It was probably just her. The imagination, a trick of light and memory. But as she walked away, she could have sworn she heard a sound carried on the wind. A low rumble that might have been a bear's call or might have been the forest itself, acknowledging the debt it owed to one of its own who had ventured into the human world to save lives. The story of the medicine bear became more than history. It became mythology, the kind of truth that transcends facts and touches something deeper in the human spirit. It reminded people that heroes don't always wear uniforms or carry weapons. Sometimes they're old men with walking sticks and worn medical bags, And sometimes, just sometimes, they're bears who understand that babies must live, that the future depends on acts of kindness that cross all boundaries of species and circumstance. In her final years, Jessica wrote a book about the experience, donating all proceeds to organizations that provided medical aid in conflict zones. The book ended with a simple dedication to Dr. Marcus Webb and Masha, who proved that love and duty know no boundaries, and to all the quiet heroes whose names we'll never know, human and animal alike, who carry hope through the darkness. The book became required reading in many medical schools, not for its medical knowledge but for its message about the nature of healing itself. That it's not just about medicine and procedures, but about the determination to help, the creativity to find solutions, and the courage to act when action seems impossible. Hope, Samuel, and Lily, the three babies whose lives had been saved, grew up to have children of their own. They made sure their children knew the story, not as a fairy tale, but as family history. "You're alive because a bear brought medicine through a war zone," they would say. "Never forget that miracles happen, but they happen because someone, or something, chooses to create them." The cabin was eventually rebuilt as a small museum, displaying Dr. Webb's journals, photographs, and maps. Visitors came from around the world to see where the story had unfolded, to walk the paths Masha had traveled. Local guides, some of whom claimed to have seen the bear during the war, would lead tours through the forest, pointing out the routes she'd taken, the places where supply caches had been hidden. On quiet nights, when the moon was full and the snow fell softly through the trees, some claimed you could still see tracks in the snow, too large to be anything but a bear, leading from the cabin toward the hospital. The rational explanation was that other bears had moved into the territory, following ancient paths that happened to coincide with Masha's routes. But those who'd lived through the war, who'd seen what they'd seen, knew better. They knew that some stories don't really end, they just transform into something else. The medicine bear had become part of the forest itself, a guardian spirit that reminded people that help can come from anywhere, that kindness can take any form, that even in the darkest times, someone or something is watching, waiting to help if we're brave enough to accept it. Jessica lived to be very old, long enough to see the region fully rebuilt, long enough to see Hope, Samuel, and Lily become grandparents themselves. On her last visit to the memorial, she was accompanied by dozens of people whose lives had been touched by Dr. Webb and Masha's story. They stood in silence, remembering not just the man and the bear, but what they represented, the unbreakable bond between all living things, the duty we have to help one another, and the miracles that can happen when we answer that call. As the sun set behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Jessica thought she understood at last what Dr. Webb had known all along. The bear hadn't just been trained to deliver medicine. She'd been taught to recognize suffering and respond with compassion. In that way, Masha had been more human than many humans, and Dr. Webb had understood that the boundaries we draw between species are meaningless when it comes to the capacity to love and to serve. The story ends where it began, with snow falling softly on a forest that holds its secrets close. Somewhere in those woods, in the space between history and legend, between fact and faith, the medicine bear continues her rounds. Not in body, perhaps, but in spirit, in the stories told and retold, in the lives saved and the futures made possible, in the proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, help can come padding through the snow on 4 paws, carrying hope in a medical bag, guided by a love that transcends species, age, and even death itself. This is the legacy of Dr. Marcus Webb and Masha. Not just the lives they saved, but the truth they proved. That compassion has no boundaries. That help comes in forms we don't expect. That sometimes, when the world seems darkest and hope seems lost, a shadow at the edge of the forest might be bringing exactly what we need to survive. And that the greatest miracles aren't the ones that fall from heaven, but the ones that walk among us, on 2 legs or 4, carrying medicine through the snow, one careful step at a time.